His family kicked us out after the funeral, but I was hiding a secret that could ruin them. My name is Claire Matthews, and I never thought I'd be the kind of person to air my private life online. But after what happened in Charleston, South Carolina, I realized my story isn't just mine, it's a warning. Last month, the person I trusted most, my husband's family, betrayed me in a way that made me question every moment of our 8 years together. It all started with grief. My husband, James, passed away suddenly after a heart attack. I thought his family and I would mourn together, support each other, and honor his memory. Instead, they blindsided me, turning the worst week of my life into a public humiliation. What they didn't know, I was already sitting on a secret that could destroy every single one of them. James and I met in our late 20s at a charity gala neither of us had really wanted to attend. He was kind, steady, and had this dry humor that caught me off guard in the best way. Sarcastic without being cruel, warm without being overbearing. We married 2 years later and built a comfortable life together. James ran a small but thriving landscaping business, and I worked in marketing. His family was complicated. On the surface, they were polite, even welcoming at times, but behind their smiles was a thin layer of judgment about my career, my city girl upbringing, and most of all, the fact that James and I had chosen not to have kids yet. Still, I made every effort to bridge the gap. Holidays, birthdays, Sunday dinners, I showed up, smiled, and quietly swallowed the passive-aggressive comments. Whenever I vented to James, he'd just shake his head and say, "That's just how they are. Don't take it personally." And because I loved him, I didn't. What I didn't know then was that how they are wasn't harmless. And one day, it would be aimed at me with full force. Before James passed, life was predictable in the best way, the kind of everyday comfort you don't fully appreciate until it's gone. We had our little rituals, Saturday mornings at the farmer's market, Friday takeout curled up on the couch, and evening walks with our dog Baxter, where we'd talk about everything and nothing at all. James's death didn't creep in slowly. It crashed into our lives without warning. One week we were finalizing plans for a beach trip. The next, I was in a sterile hospital waiting room, clutching lukewarm coffee and praying for a miracle that never came. When the doctors delivered the news, it felt like the floor beneath me had vanished. His family arrived within hours, and in the fog of shock, I welcomed their presence. We sat together to arrange the funeral, passing tissues, sharing stories, crying in the same room. In those moments, I believed grief might smooth over the rough edges between us. I thought tragedy had a way of stripping people down to their humanity, of reminding them what really mattered. I thought, naively, that James's death would bring us closer. I was wrong. The first crack appeared the morning after the funeral. I shuffled into the kitchen in my pajamas, still groggy from a night of restless sleep, and found James's sister Marla methodically going through our cabinets. She glanced up, flashing a saccharine smile. "Just helping tidy up," she said, as if rifling through my pantry at dawn was completely normal. Later that afternoon, James's older brother, Greg, leaned against the doorway while I was making tea. He looked around the living room, eyes lingering on the photos, the furniture, the house itself. "You know," he said casually, "this place has always been part of the family legacy." I smiled faintly, thinking he meant it in a sentimental way. But then he repeated the word legacy with a weight that made my stomach tighten. By the third day, the pretense was gone. Marla and Greg began openly discussing reorganizing James's belongings, pulling items from closets, debating where family heirlooms should go. They didn't ask. They didn't pause to consider how it felt to watch them handle his things like inventory on a checklist. The undercurrent was clear. This wasn't my home anymore. It was theirs, or so they believed. I told myself they were grieving too, that their need to control something was part of their process. But deep down, I knew grief wasn't what I was seeing. It was calculation. It all came to a head on the 4th day after the funeral. I'd stepped out to walk Baxter and came back to find Marla standing in the living room, a thick envelope in her hands. The return address made my stomach drop. Our bank. And it was addressed to me. Marla didn't look startled to be caught. She didn't even look guilty. Instead, her lips curled into something halfway between a smirk and a sneer. "This should have gone to the family," she said, like the matter was already settled. I tightened my grip on my keys. I am family. That's when Greg appeared from the hallway, arms folded, eyes cold. Not anymore, he said flatly. Without James, you're just a guest here, and we've decided it's best if you move out by the end of the week. The room seemed to tilt, but my mind suddenly snapped into focus. My heart pounded, but the fog of grief lifted, replaced by something sharper. Calculation. They thought they could muscle me out of the home James and I built together. They thought I'd just pack up my life and leave quietly, grateful for the scraps of their false kindness. But they didn't know what I knew. Before James passed, we'd had long, difficult conversations about his family. Their creative bookkeeping, the offshore accounts, the assets tucked neatly away to avoid taxes. He hadn't trusted them, and he'd made sure I knew exactly where every shred of proof was hidden. And now, as Marla clutched that envelope like she'd just won, I realized I was holding something far more powerful. They wanted me gone by the end of the week. They had no idea they'd just started a countdown, for them. If they wanted to humiliate me in my grief, I'd return the favor, except mine wouldn't be petty snide remarks over coffee. Mine would be calculated, devastating, and backed with hard, irrefutable evidence. I didn't want to just slip away quietly into some apartment and let them think they'd won. I wanted every smiling face in their carefully curated social circle to see them for exactly what they were: greedy, manipulative frauds hiding behind a veneer of family values. And the perfect opportunity fell right into my lap: the memorial dinner they'd planned for the following Saturday. It wasn't just any dinner, it was a showpiece, a catered event at their country club, packed with extended relatives, wealthy business contacts, and half the church congregation. The kind of crowd they prided themselves on impressing. I knew exactly how I'd play it. I'd show up gracious, subdued, the grieving widow they underestimated. I'd let them make their speeches about family unity and honoring James's legacy. Then, when the room was warm with sentiment and all eyes were on them, I'd pull out the neatly organized folder from my bag. Bank statements, offshore account records, email printouts, enough to make every handshake in that room recoil. It wouldn't just be revenged, it would be a public unmasking so thorough that they couldn't spin it, bury it, or smile their way out of it. They wanted me gone. I was about to make sure they were the ones with nowhere left to stand. The days leading up to the dinner were a blur of rage and calculation. I thought of every time I'd bitten my tongue at Marla's condescending remarks, every smug smile from Greg when he dismissed my opinions, every quiet sacrifice I'd made to fit into their world. Now they were trying to erase me completely, as if my love, my marriage, and the years I spent by James's side counted for nothing. What they didn't understand was that James had trusted me in ways he'd never trusted them. Over late-night glasses of wine, after tough days at work, he'd confide in me about the family business and the lengths his siblings went to in order to protect their money from taxes. He'd shown me documents, almost as a joke, telling me I was the only one he could trust with the truth. I hadn't thought much of it at the time, but now, those files were no longer a quirky footnote in our marriage. They were my arsenal. I wasn't just fueled by anger, I was anchored by a cold, methodical resolve. This wasn't about petty revenge. This was about reclaiming my dignity, my place, and making sure they could never do this to anyone else again. By the night of the dinner, I was ready. Not just to defend myself, but to end the charade they'd built their entire reputation on. I spent the next 3 days in a quiet, almost surgical state of focus. Grief had given way to purpose. In the home office, I pulled open every drawer, file cabinet, and storage box James had ever touched. I found exactly what I was looking for: bank statements that didn't match their public filings, shell company registrations in obscure jurisdictions, property deeds with signatures I knew weren't legitimate. I even found email printouts, James's own correspondence with Greg and Marla, discussing asset protection strategies that, in plain English, meant tax evasion and fraud. I scanned and organized everything, labeling each file in chronological order. By the time I was done, I had a small but devastating portfolio, more than enough to start a fire that would be impossible for them to put out. Then I wrote my speech, just a few paragraphs. Calm, measured, irrefutable, no screaming, no theatrics, just facts, laid bare in front of the people whose opinions they valued most. I rehearsed it in front of the mirror, timing my pauses, practicing the way I'd look directly at them before turning to the audience. I imagined the moment the polite, tight-lipped smiles around the table would dissolve into shock. The memorial dinner wasn't going to be about remembering James anymore. It was going to be the night the truth slipped into their perfectly curated world and ripped it apart from the inside. By Saturday, I wasn't just ready, I was steady, and I knew exactly where I'd be sitting so that when the moment came, no one would miss a single word. The memorial dinner unfolded exactly as I'd pictured it, stiff politeness wrapped in crystal glassware and candlelight. The family's grand dining room gleamed under the chandelier, every inch curated to project wealth and respectability. Guests whispered softly, sharing memories of James, unaware that the evening was about to take a hard turn. When it was my turn to speak, I rose slowly, my fingers brushing the folder resting on my lap. I let the silence settle before I began. I loved James deeply, I said, my voice steady, and I want to honor him with honesty, because he valued that above all else. Then I opened the folder and began to read. Dates, bank accounts, shell company names, property deeds, tax records, transactions funneled through accounts in the Cayman Islands. I spoke clearly, without embellishment, letting the facts land like stones in still water. A sharp gasp echoed from somewhere down the table. Someone's fork clattered onto their plate. Guests exchanged wide-eyed glances, the weight of my words sinking in. Marla's complexion drained to paper white. Greg's jaw tightened so hard I thought his teeth might crack. I finished with a calm smile. James didn't want this to come out, but since you've decided I'm no longer family, I'm not bound by family loyalty. I set the folder on the table in front of me, slid it toward the nearest guest, someone I knew sat on the local tax board, and walked out without waiting for applause or questions. Behind me, the room erupted, not with polite clapping, but with a chaotic mix of murmurs, accusations, and the sound of two people watching their carefully constructed image crumble in real time. Marla's voice cut through the murmurs, sharp and trembling. "Sit down, now." It wasn't a request. It was the frantic command of someone watching control slip through her fingers. Greg forced a laugh, the kind that sounded more like a choke. She's delusional. Grief does strange things to people. His eyes darted around the table, searching for an ally, but all he found were stony faces and raised brows. One of their longest-standing business partners quietly pushed back his chair and left without a word, his untouched wine glass still full. Another guest leaned forward, voice low but carrying across the table. "Are the authorities already aware of this?" I didn't say a word. I didn't need to. Instead, I met Greg's glare with a slow, deliberate smile, the kind that says, checkmate. Then I turned and walked toward the door, leaving them to stew in a room thick with suspicion and the first ripples of the social downfall they'd never see coming. By Monday morning, the whispers had turned into full-blown wildfire. Word of my little speech traveled faster than I could have imagined. Greg's biggest client abruptly pulled out of a multi-year contract, citing ethical concerns. Marla's husband's firm announced she was being temporarily suspended pending an internal audit, which everyone knew was code for "we're distancing ourselves before the damage gets worse." The family's polished image, one they'd spent decades curating, was unraveling thread by thread. Invitations they once received without question stopped arriving. Business associates were suddenly too busy to take their calls. And me? I was exactly where they didn't want me to be, still living in the house James and I had made a home. What they didn't know, until they tried to push me out, was that James had quietly transferred the deed to my name 6 months before he died. No matter how many lawyers they called or threats they whispered, the truth was simple. They had no legal claim, no leverage, and now no reputation. I wasn't just surviving without James, I was thriving, right in the place they thought they could take from me. Betrayal doesn't always come from strangers. More often, it comes from the people who have shaken your hand, hugged you at holidays, and smiled at you across the dinner table while quietly plotting against you. For years, I tried to fit into James's family, biting my tongue, ignoring the slights, convincing myself that tolerance was the high road. But grief has a way of stripping away illusions. In my most vulnerable moment, they showed me exactly who they were. What I learned is this: protecting yourself isn't vindictive, it's survival. People like them rely on silence, on the assumption that you won't speak up because it's family or inappropriate. They weaponize politeness to keep their wrongdoings hidden. But the truth doesn't lose its power just because it makes people uncomfortable. In fact, sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is stand calmly in a room full of their allies and speak the truth they've worked so hard to bury. That night at the memorial dinner, I didn't raise my voice. I didn't cry. I simply told the truth and let their own actions do the rest. And the beauty of truth is, once it's out, you can't stuff it back in the envelope. And that's how the family who tried to erase me ended up erasing their own reputations instead. I didn't need to shout or throw a drink or cause a dramatic scene, just a few well-chosen words, the right audience, and the kind of truth that leaves no room for denial. They wanted me out of the picture, but instead, I became the one picture their entire social circle can't forget. If you were in my position, would you have gone public at the memorial dinner, letting the whole room hear it at once, or would you have kept it quiet and let the lawyers dismantle them behind closed doors? Because here's what I learned. Sometimes the most satisfying justice isn't the kind served in court. It's the kind delivered in real time, with every single person watching as the guilty are unmasked.